Jon Snow stood upon the battlements of White Harbor, the chill wind off the bight sweeping across the city's crowded docks. The sky overhead had that steel-gray hue so common in the north, and the gulls wheeled low, their cries echoing off the stout walls of the new castle. The scent of salt and fish intermingled with the crisp northern air, and despite the bustle below, Jon found a strange calm drifting through his thoughts. If he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine he was back at the wall, listening to the wind moan through the ice. But the tang of the sea was different, sharper, vital, full of promise. Here, in White Harbor, his future had unfolded, one he had scarcely believed possible just a few years earlier. He did not wear the black cloak of the Night's Watch anymore. That vow had died in the swirling snow near Castle Black, at a time when duty demanded new paths. The scars of his demise, literal and figurative, had not vanished. They never would. But the realm needed him, people said, especially the North. And so Jon had learned to live again, learned to shape his life to the needs of those who looked to him for guidance. In the end, it was Wyman Manderly, Lord of White Harbor, who had extended a lifeline. When the ravages of the wars and the cruelty of the Boltons had ravaged the region, House Stark needed strong allies. And what stronger alliance than a marriage between the newly recognized king in the north, though he still shied from the title, and one of the most powerful lords south of the Neck. In his youth, Jon Snow had never pictured himself a husband. Bastards seldom dreamed of such things, at least not openly. But times had changed. The hidden truth of his parentage had been whispered among a trusted few, though officially he stood before the North as the late Ned Stark's son, rightful heir to Winterfell in Sansa's absence or with her blessing, though in truth they shared the rule. That arrangement had satisfied most of the North, for Sansa carried the name Stark, and Jon carried the intangible aura of Ned's memory upon his face. Yet, in forging alliances, a marriage was as old a strategy as the first men. His bride was Lady Elora Manderly, Lord Wyman's daughter. She was not the eldest. Willa Manderly had died tragically while they were besieged in the period after the Red Wedding, though rumors conflicted about how and where. Elora was the next in line, a few years younger than Jon, with hair the color of new-fallen snow that framed a pale, sharp-featured face. She bore a resolute grace about her, reminiscent of her father's presence in council, but softened by a gentle smile that flitted across her features now and again. Growing up in a bustling port had taught her to navigate commerce and conversation as deftly as a fisherman might handle his nets. She was no warrior, but she had spent her life studying the tapestry of trade, the intricacies of alliances, and the whisper networks that ran from White Harbor to the free cities. Jon remembered the day of the wedding, the great September in White Harbor blazing with 1,000 candles and draped in banners. The merman of House Manderly, resplendent in silver and green, had been hung beside the dire wolf of House Stark. Lords and ladies had come from across the north, and a few from the Vale, eager to see the new future forged by this union. Outside, in the city, the people had filled the streets to celebrate. After the horrors of war, the northern folk were hungry for any sign that stability, and maybe even prosperity, might return. The Manderlys had been known for their wealth and their devotion to House Stark, and with Jon's presence, it felt to many as if the wrongs of the past might be undone at last. It had been a curious ceremony for Jon, for he had scarcely found a moment to compose himself in the swirl of well-wishers, the swirl of solemn pronouncements, and the swirl of hope that billowed around them both. Elora stood in front of him, draped in an elegant gown of sea green and white, pearls embroidered along the cuffs. Her eyes were bright and determined, yet a tremor betrayed her nerves. Jon felt his own pulse thunder within his chest as the septon intoned words about duty, honor, and the joining of families. When it came time to speak his vows, he remembered his voice coming out steady. He had pledged himself to Lady Elora Manderly, solemn and true, before all those gathered and the old gods and the new. The entire city roared its approval once the union was sealed with a kiss. Somewhere in the crowd, Sansa stood smiling, tears sparkling on her cheeks. Lord Wyman's thunderous applause could be heard above all the rest, accompanied by the claps of robed Manderly cousins and the northern lords who had longed for exactly this moment. A sign that the Stark cause endured, that the future was being forged from the ruins of war. Afterward, there had been feasting and music, dancing and toasts. White Harbor's famous harvest from the sea, crabs, clams, mussels, cod, salmon, overflowed from tables. The highlight had been the Manderly tradition of the mighty three-layered meat pie, one stuffed with pork, bacon, and fish, baked to mouth-watering perfection. Flagons of ale and wine were emptied in endless flow, while boisterous conversation filled the banquet halls. Even Sir Davos Seaworth had smiled at the memory, though he watched his cups more carefully than some salt and smoke had taught him many lessons. Yet, after all the festivities had died down, after the final toast had been uttered and the final dancer had collapsed from exhaustion, a hush had descended upon White Harbor. In the morning, John and Elora awoke in their shared chambers, the unfamiliar sense of closeness and the faint hush of the sea lapping the docks painting a new reality. Neither had been prepared for the weight of it all. John had dreamt of dead brothers in black cloaks, of a friend turned foe, of dire wolves and dragons overhead. Elora had dreamt of the day she'd stand as a lady of White Harbor in earnest, guiding commerce through the city and ensuring her father's legacy lived on. Now the two threads had woven together. While the city hummed with life, they both understood that the real challenge was only just beginning. White Harbor, the North's gateway to the sea, was poised to become more than just the port of the Starks. The Union promised a new era, one in which the wealth of House Manderly, combined with the leadership of House Stark or Targaryen blood, if truth were to be told, would make White Harbor a power that even lords south of the Neck could not ignore. The Vale might have the Eyrie perched on high, the Riverlands their fertile valleys, and the Crownlands their seat of royal authority, but the North needed strength that extended beyond the bitter cold of Winterfell and the black silhouette of the Wall. With the Boltons gone, the Umbers and Karstarks subdued, and the loyal houses gathering around, the time was ripe for a seat of maritime might that could carry the northern cause outward in trade, alliances, and, if needed, war. In the weeks following their wedding, Jon and Elora found themselves grappling with the finer points of governance. Sansa wrote from Winterfell, letting Jon know of the progress in restoring the castle's collapsed towers and gathering the harvest. She was the Lady of Winterfell by the old law, but she welcomed Jon's help in forging alliances, always mindful that the North could ill afford further division. When messages came about shipments of timber from the Wolfswood or grain from the newly reseeded fields around the last hearth, Elora was often the one to negotiate shipping schedules, freight costs, and taxes, for her father had taught her well. Jon observed, impressed, as she balanced revenues and expenses with the surety of a seasoned steward. At first, some northern lords grumbled about a woman who handled gold and ships instead of merely tapestries, but Wyman Manderly had never raised an idle daughter. Over time, even the gruffest of them recognized the value in her skill. White Harbor itself had seen scars from the wars. Walls had needed repairs. The foundations of some older warehouses along the docks had crumbled due to neglect, and the flow of trade had slowed during the chaos of the Boltons' reign. Elora took the lead in organizing the harbor's reconstruction. She personally oversaw the hiring of masons and carpenters, ensuring that fair wages enticed skilled workers to return. Fishermen had begun to crowd the newly repaired piers, lured by the promise of prosperity and peace. The minted silver from the city's trade, stamped with a wolf's head on one side and a merman on the other, began circulating across the North, a sign of renewed confidence. Lord Wyman might have had the final say in such matters in years past, but age had made him more than happy to share authority, especially with Jon now by his daughter's side. Meanwhile, Jon found himself juggling tasks he'd never imagined. He had grown accustomed to commanding men in battle, leading rangers beyond the wall, dealing with wildlings and whites, but negotiating shipping rights with merchants from Bravos or Pentos felt like an entirely new warfront. Elora guided him, instructing him on the art of gentle persuasion. In turn, he offered her insights into forging alliances with the fierce mountain clans who cared little for gold but a great deal for honor. Together, they began to weave a tapestry of unity, one that extended beyond White Harbor's walls to every corner of the North. If some still refused to bend, they found themselves alone and quickly softened their stance when faced with the region's new solidarity. The first few months of their marriage saw the city's fortunes rise. More ships docked every day, returning the harbor to its pre-war splendor. Trade with the Vale improved. The Gulltown merchants found a reliable market for their goods here, especially once the snows began to recede. And though Westeros at large still seethed with unresolved tensions, southern lords squabbling, the Reach uncertain after its own upheavals, White Harbor carved out a reputation as a sanctuary of sorts, a place for fair trade. Elora suggested that they establish a special fund to help rebuild northern villages that had been razed during the war, and Jon supported the measure wholeheartedly. The council in White Harbor agreed, the coffers filling with the city's profits from renewed commerce. Northern families slowly but surely began to mend. Yet not everything was so simple. Power invites envy, and envy breeds conflict. At first, the discontent seemed minor. Petty thieves plundering supply carts on the outskirts of the city, rumors whispered in shadowed taverns about the Manderlys growing too bold, the new king in the north forgetting the old ways. Some of these rumors came from far afield, reaching even the taverns of White Harbor's Old Town district. Jon recognized early on that the name Snow carried a stigma among certain traditionalists, and the notion that a bastard, regardless of whatever the crown or the northern lords might have decided, could hold power unsettled them. Elora reminded him gently that they would prove such doubters wrong through action, not argument. Despite her calm tone, he could see her own frustration simmering beneath the surface. House Manderly had bled for the Starks, and the Manderlys did not forget. Sansa arrived in White Harbor late in the third moon after their wedding, accompanied by a small retinue of loyal guards and ladies-in-waiting. She embraced Jon warmly and greeted Elora with a mixture of courtesy and genuine fondness. The two women had corresponded often, but seeing them together in the same hall, both the calm, poised presence of Sansa Stark and the shrewd, sea-worn intelligence of Elora Manderly, stirred a sense of pride in Jon. Here were two corners of the North's future, joined in purpose if not by blood. Sansa had come to discuss the new shipments of grain heading up the White Knife, to share news from Winterfell, and to address a matter of some urgency. Certain lords grumbled about White Harbor's rising star, about the idea that the seat of House Stark's power might shift away from Winterfell. Sansa dismissed such notions out of hand, asserting that Winterfell was the seat of the Starks and always would be. But if White Harbor grew stronger, that was a boon for all the North, not a slight. The question remained whether these lords, some of them proud men nursing old wounds, would see it that way. At a large gathering in the main hall of Newcastle, Sansa and Jon fielded questions from lords and ladies who had come from around the North for an audience. Elora listened, occasionally weaving in her own insights whenever the matters touched on trade or shipping. Lord Glover of Deepwood Mott presented concerns about raiders along the western coast, reported to be Ironborn who had slipped away from their petty squabbles in the Isles. The Mormonts echoed these worries, fearful that Bear Island's fleets might not be enough to protect the shipping lanes. Jon offered that House Manderly's new war galleys, which were under construction in the harbor, might patrol the coastline to protect against piracy, so long as lords would help man them. The proposal was well received by some, met with guarded acceptance by others. But a sense of unity prevailed when a messenger from King's Landing, who had been waiting to deliver a letter, was finally admitted. He was a thin man in dusty traveling clothes, bearing a parchment sealed with the newly minted royal sigil, whoever the occupant of the throne might be at that time, though the realm's politics had grown so tangled, few in the North cared to keep pace. The letter demanded an accounting of the taxes owed from the North's renewed trade. In an abrupt shift, tensions that had been simmering over local feuds found a new target: the crown. Sansa diplomatically assured the messenger that the North would honor its obligations once the crown's own obligations to assist in rebuilding the region were met. The tension in the hall grew thick as honey, but the messenger, clearly out of his depth, simply bowed and retreated. No one had illusions that the crown would willingly concede anything, yet the letter itself reminded all in attendance that the war might have ended, but the Game of Thrones went on. In the days that followed, Jon and Elora found themselves the focus of countless rumor-laden tongues. Some said the two newlyweds planned to break the North away from the Seven Kingdoms entirely, forging an independent realm with White Harbor as its capital. Others claimed they were amassing a secret fleet to challenge the Royal Navy, that hidden cogs and dramens were being built in secret coves along the northern coast. John snorted at the absurdity of it, but there was enough half-truth in the fact that new ships were indeed being built that the rumor proved persistent. Elora, for her part, deftly addressed the concerns of local merchants, explaining that these ships were to keep the peace and protect trade, not to threaten the realm. Her calm, measured assurance soothed most, but the seeds of suspicion seldom die easily in a land so scarred by betrayal. One afternoon, not long after Sansa departed to return to Winterfell, Jon joined Elora on a walk through the docks. The gulls circled overhead, and the bustle of laborers hoisting crates of goods onto ships lent the air a vibrant hum. Elora wore a heavy cloak lined with fur, her hands tucked into a muff to ward off the cold. Jon wore a simpler cloak of dark gray, the stark sigil on his left breast. They walked side by side, occasionally pausing to inspect a new galley under construction or to speak with the men laboring in the briny chill. Most recognized them immediately, tipping hats or bowing heads in respect. Elora teased a few of the old fishermen, calling them by name, reminding them of jokes shared in her youth. The men responded with wide, missing-tooth grins, clapping their fists to their chests as a sign of loyalty. Jon watched, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, but he could not help noticing shadows around the perimeter, small clusters of cloaked figures who seemed uninterested in the day's commerce, more intent on the comings and goings of the new king and queen in all but name. Once, Jon caught the flash of an unfriendly stare from beneath the hood. He instinctively rested a hand on the pommel of Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword that hung at his side, though he did not draw it. Elora noticed his motion and glanced at the figure. Whoever lurked there slipped away into the crowd. Though not an immediate threat, the silent watchers underlined Jon's intuition that not everyone welcomed White Harbor's ascendance. In the weeks that followed, a spate of minor incidents rattled the city. A warehouse scheduled to store a shipment of grain for distribution to outlying hamlets suddenly burned in the night. 2 guards patrolling the city walls vanished, their corpses later found floating in the harbor. A rumor circulated that a certain Sellsword company from the Free Cities was sniffing around, looking for a wealthy patron. Each event, taken alone, might have been chalked up to misfortune, but together they stirred suspicion. Elora feared the involvement of resentful lords or unscrupulous merchants from the south who wished to undermine White Harbor's rise. Jon, trained by years of subterfuge at the Wall and beyond, suspected a deeper plot. He quietly conferred with trusted men, including some who had served as rangers in the Night's Watch, to watch for any sign of infiltration or sabotage. Late one night, the newlyweds found themselves alone in the solar of the Merman's Court, a quiet chamber lit by flickering candlelight and warmed by a brazier of coals. Thick tapestries depicting maritime scenes covered the walls, woven with silver and sea-green threads. A large window overlooked the harbor, where the moonlight shimmered on the dark water. Elora sat at a wide table strewn with ledgers, receipts, and scrolls detailing the comings and goings of ships. Jon stood behind her, reading over one of the reports. His presence was a reassuring warmth against her back. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "We're making progress, but the sabotage is costing us. We lost 3 ships worth of cargo last week alone because the captains refused to sail, fearing there might be saboteurs among their crews." Jon set the paper down. "We'll find those responsible. The men I spoke to are discreet. If they discover who's behind this, we'll put a stop to it." Elora turned to him, her eyes reflecting the candle's glow. "Sometimes I wonder if my father foresaw all of this when he insisted on this marriage. The war took so much from us. We Manderlys always remained loyal to House Stark, and I do believe in you, Jon. In us. But I never realized how many forces would be arrayed against us once we began to rebuild." Jon knelt beside her chair, slipping his hand around hers. "I never wanted power, but if it means protecting the North, protecting our people from the Wall to the sea, then I'll fight this battle too. I won't let them undo the peace we've all bled for." She studied him in silence, seeing the stark determination etched in his face. In that moment, he looked so much like Ned Stark, though behind his dark eyes lay a swirl of old grief and quiet rage. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I believe you." They remained that way for a time, the night deepening around them, breath mingling in the golden shadows. Though they had wed for duty, for alliance, for the future, a sense of partnership had begun to blossom. A fragile tendril of trust and affection that might yet take root if given care. Elora felt her see. Hess tighten with something like hope. They were forging a new northern order in White Harbor. Perhaps it was only natural that old enemies and new challengers would surface, testing their resolve. The next day, they rode out at dawn with a small company of guards, both Manderly men-at-arms and a handful of loyal Stark soldiers from Winterfell. Their destination was an old watchtower perched on a cliff outside the city proper, a vantage point that overlooked the harbor's approach. For years, the tower had lain abandoned, used sporadically by militia but never fully manned. Elora had proposed renovating it, turning it into a sentinel post to protect ships coming in and out. Jon agreed, seeing the value in an early warning system against raiders or saboteurs. The road leading there was winding, hugging the rocky coastline. Below, the sea churned gray-green, flecked with foam. Gulls screeched overhead. As they approached the tower, Jon noticed signs of fresh footprints. Perhaps the workers Lord Wyman had sent out to begin the repairs. But the men who accompanied them seemed uneasy. One dismounted near the tower's base, drawing his sword. The day's light cast long shadows across the rocks. Elora pulled up on her mare's reins, scanning the area. Silence, punctuated only by the hiss of the wind and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Jon signaled for caution. He dismounted, leaving his horse in the care of a guard. Drawing Longclaw, he ascended the winding stone steps that led to the tower's entrance. The iron-bound door was ajar, swaying slightly. Inside, a stench of blood and death greeted him. Two of the workers lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, throats slit, eyes staring blindly. Elora gasped behind him, pressing a hand to her mouth. Jon's jaw tightened, but he pressed on, leading the guards up the spiral staircase. At the top, more signs of violence. Overturned crates, scattered tools, but no sign of the attackers. His guards fanned out, searching for any threat. The killer had long since fled. One guard discovered footprints leading to a rear exit that opened onto a narrow path along the cliff. Perhaps the murderer had fled by boat or had descended the dangerous path to the rocky shore below. Furious, Jon ordered the men to secure the tower and search the shoreline. Elora stood near the bodies of the workers, tears brimming in her eyes. These had been local men, simple laborers hoping to earn coin repairing an old watchtower, only to be murdered for reasons unknown. Jon stepped over, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He felt her trembling. She was no stranger to violence, no northerner was after the wars, but this was a senseless atrocity, aimed at undermining their plans. Once the guards concluded their search, they found nothing but a few scattered footprints and the battered remains of a small rowboat on the rocks below. The footprints led inland, suggesting that some of the attackers had doubled back into the forest. Had the saboteurs planned to demolish the tower? There were no barrels of wildfire or casks of pitch left behind. Perhaps the murders were a warning, or an attempt to stall the tower's reconstruction by terrorizing the workers. Either way, the message was clear. White Harbor's enemies were at large, ready to strike whenever they found a weakness. They returned to the city with grim resolve. Elora ordered additional guards posted at the tower, promising the families of the slain workers full recompense and a bounty for any information leading to the murderers. Jon authorized an increased city watch at night, organizing patrols through the districts where trouble might brew. Word spread quickly of the murders, and with it, fear. Some whispered of red priests stirring trouble, others of iron-born reavers, others still of men loyal to the Boltons or the Freys, seeking to sow chaos. That last rumor, no matter how improbable, ignited old anger in many hearts. The Boltons were gone. Their line ended, but hatred lingered. In the midst of these dark tidings, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Sansa wrote that tensions with some of the mountain clans had eased, thanks in part to her promises of shared resources, but a more pressing matter had come from beyond the wall. Tormund Giantsbane had sent word of renewed sightings of whites near the Frostfangs. Though many thought the threat of the others had ended after the great battles near the wall and the fall of the Night King, pockets of undead evidently still roamed, requiring vigilance. The news weighed heavily on Jon's mind. Even as the North struggled to rebuild, the memory of that ancient horror refused to be banished entirely. He knew that men with short memories might consider it a story told to frighten children, but he had seen too much to dismiss the threat. The North's true battle had never been for kingship or gold. It had always been survival. Against this backdrop, Jon considered the necessity of forging White Harbor into a true fortress city, a bastion that could serve as a rallying point should the unthinkable ever rise again. The old walls around the port had been built to repel raiders, not an army of the dead, but perhaps new modifications could help. If they improved watchtowers along the coast, built stronger gates, and maintained a standing garrison, they might be able to fend off raiders or any other threat. Elora supported the plan, and together they approached Lord Wyman with proposals for expansions to the city's fortifications. The corpulent but shrewd Lord of White Harbor listened carefully, nodding in agreement as they laid out their ideas. He approved, though he reminded them that gold did not come without cost. Increasing taxes would risk angering merchants, but the city's growth thus far provided a rare opportunity to invest in security. As the building continued, so did political maneuvering. A letter arrived from the Vale from Lord Royce, inquiring about a potential betrothal between one of Elora's cousins and a young Aaron Ward. Elora saw the advantage in binding the Vale to White Harbor more closely, considering their maritime interests aligned. Jon was less enthused about the idea of mixing so many alliances at once, but he deferred to Elora's instincts. She had grown up learning the subtle interplay of interhouse marriages, a dance of family ties that could span continents. In the North, alliances were usually simpler, grounded in neighborly ties and centuries of tradition. But White Harbor looked outward to the sea, and that meant forging new pathways. In the end, he gave his blessing, content to trust Elora on matters of southern politicking. Meanwhile, the presence of suspicious figures around the city did not abate. Reports trickled in that unknown men sought the services of local sellswords. One day, a bar fight erupted in the Fish Market district, leaving several men wounded. The city guard discovered that half the brawlers were mercenaries from across the narrow sea, recently arrived under vague pretenses. When questioned, they claimed they had come seeking work as caravan guards or ship escorts. Yet their coin bore the imprint of the Lannister lion, old minted currency from Casterly Rock. That alone did not signify a conspiracy. Coins traveled as widely as rumors, but it fueled suspicions. Jon convened his trusted advisors, including Ralph Stonebeard, a hulking ex-ranger, and Maester Theo Moore, a thin man with kind eyes and a keen mind for political rumor. They agreed that caution was paramount. The City Watch began rounding up known troublemakers, quietly interrogating them. In time, they unearthed a tenuous thread. Some of these men had been paid to disrupt White Harbor's shipping lanes, to sow chaos and fear so that merchants would think twice before forging contracts with the Manderlys. As to who paid them, the answers were less clear. A few mercenaries let slip references to merchants from the Westerlands or unscrupulous traders from the Reach. More than one name surfaced that connected to lesser lords who once bent the knee to House Bolton for profit. The truth, Jon realized, was that the North's reemergence as a trading power threatened more than one interest across the realm. Kings might stand aside while their lesser bannermen ventured into such sabotage, or they might even privately encourage it. The game was old, and the North had been its pawn before. But not this time. Jon faced a moral dilemma. To crack down with ruthless efficiency might deter future attacks, but it would also risk harming innocent travelers and might turn away legitimate commerce. Elora counseled restraint, urging him to focus on the ringleaders. She set about working her network of informants, individuals who frequented the taverns and inns, chatting up sailors and caravanners. The Manderlys had cultivated loyal men and women in the city for generations, a quiet ring of watchers who could smell out rumors before they turned dangerous. Jon trusted Elora's skill, for she carried herself with the self-assurance of someone who understood White Harbor's pulse. If sabotage was a disease creeping into the city, her watchful eyes would detect its symptoms early. As the maritime defenses improved, a new era began to dawn in the harborside. Galleys flying the banner of the Wolf and Merman patrolled the coast, a sight that heartened local fishermen and unnerved lurking pirates. Merchants from Essos, seeing safer ports, increased their visits. Spices from Lys, silks from Myr, even the rare metals from Volantis found their way onto the docks. Northerners who once considered foreign luxuries an oddity now began to appreciate the variety, though the hearty staples of the region, ale, meats, and fish, remained beloved. White Harbor's coin continued to flow, and soon it became apparent that House Manderly had grown wealthier than it had been in living memory. With wealth came the need for wise stewardship. Elora and John each took on new tasks in administering the city. She spearheaded the reorganization of the harbormaster's office, insisting on transparent accounting of all ship manifests. Smuggling existed in every port, but if they could reduce it, the city's coffers would benefit and criminals would find it harder to hide. John oversaw the establishment of a new city guard headquarters, ensuring that well-trained men patrolled more than just the docks, venturing into the back alleys and the labyrinthine streets, shining a light on where thieves might lurk. They aimed to clean up the city's underbelly, not because they believed they could eliminate crime entirely, but because they wanted White Harbor to remain a beacon rather than fall into decay. In the quiet hours of the night, when the hustle of the port receded and the tides whispered against the quays, John and Elora often found themselves alone in their chambers, reflecting on the day's challenges. Over steaming bowls of fish stew or simpler fare, they would share concerns, hopes, and fleeting reflections on how far they'd come since the vow that joined them. The marriage had begun as an alliance, a pragmatic bond to strengthen the North. But slowly, as they navigated crisis after crisis, a deeper bond of respect and partnership emerged. Elora confided that she admired John's unwavering sense of duty, though she worried he shouldered too much. John, in turn, discovered in Elora a steadfast resilience that reminded him of his sister Arya. Courageous, if not in the form of a blade, then in her willingness to face the unknown. Over time, awkward courtesies began to dissolve, replaced by genuine warmth. They laughed at each other's jokes, found comfort in each other's presence, and learned to read each other's moods with surprising ease. Elora's father, Lord Wyman, watched all of this with paternal pride and relief. He was well aware of the rumors that claimed he had merely sold his daughter for political gain. But in truth, he loved Elora fiercely, and he believed that a strong alliance with House Stark would ensure her well-being and the prosperity of the city he cherished. Wyman's health had grown more fragile in recent months. His old wounds, combined with his considerable bulk, slowed him. Yet his mind remained sharp, and he advised both John and Elora when needed, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. He insisted they never forget that White Harbor belonged to the North first, but it also drew strength from beyond, from ships that crossed the sea and merchants who brought stories from every corner of the known world. As the year turned and the first snows began to dust the city's rooftops, White Harbor entered a season of quiet tension. The expansions of the wall and towers were nearly complete, the city watch well-trained. Trade routes remained open, though storms out of the shivering sea made winter voyages perilous. Beyond the walls, the farmland around White Harbor hunkered down for the cold, storing grain and salted fish to outlast the frost. Some houses that had once hesitated to bend the knee to the newly recognized king in the north now sent envoys to White Harbor, seeking to share in the city's newfound prosperity. The Manderlys welcomed them courteously, though not without noting which ones had withheld support during the darkest days. Forgiveness might be extended, but memory lingered. John felt the weight of every day's reports piling up on him. He had not expected to be a king, though many called him that, but here he was, forging alliances, quelling disputes, and trying to ensure the realm's safety. A realm that might, by the time winter fully arrived, be fully reliant on White Harbor's shipping for supplies. The rest of the North turned to him and Elora for guidance, a fact that did not escape the attention of their enemies. Spies, saboteurs, mercenaries, all seemed determined to hamper their progress. But so far, None had made a decisive move. The watchtower murders remained unsolved, though the City Watch had apprehended several low-level thugs who had likely participated. They professed ignorance of who had ordered it. No matter what punishments or bribes were offered, the real mastermind remained hidden. One evening, just after the first true snowfall, John received an unexpected visitor in the city's audience chamber. A robed woman with silvered hair, flanked by two tall, stern men, arrived unannounced. She claimed to be an envoy from Pentos, requesting a private audience. Elora was away at the time, managing an issue with a merchant vessel, so John met the stranger alone, accompanied only by a pair of guards. The woman introduced herself as Miranai Rothgar, a wealthy pentoshi trader with interests in the spice trade. She was polite, articulate, and offered lavish compliments about White Harbor's recent growth. Then, after a series of pleasantries, she made an offer. She wished to establish a permanent pentoshi trading enclave within the city, paying House Manderly, indeed the king in the north as well, a handsome tribute in gold. Her presence was unusual. Pentoshi merchants often traveled in groups, and rarely did they come with such bold proposals unannounced. John listened intently, his instincts tingling with caution. He asked Miranai why she had come so directly to White Harbor, bypassing the usual channels. She smiled, explaining she believed in forging direct relationships with the most powerful figures, cutting out meddlesome middlemen. Her gaze flickered around the chamber, taking in the stone walls, the tapestries, the insignia of House Manderly. He asked for time to consider her offer and requested that she submit it in writing so that Lady Elora might review it. Miranai agreed graciously, then withdrew. John watched her depart, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Something about the woman's timing, her directness, reminded him of the labyrinthine politics he had hoped to leave behind at the wall. Once he might have been naive, but he had died a naive man and came back cautious. When Elora returned and heard of the meeting, she shared John's suspicions. Nevertheless, they both agreed that if the offer was genuine, it could bring great wealth to White Harbor. The key was to ensure the enclave did not become a foothold for foreign powers to meddle in northern affairs. That night, the two of them pored over the written proposal Miranai provided, analyzing every clause. Sure enough, subtle wording implied that the pentoshi would seek extraterritorial rights, setting up their own laws within the enclave. Elora frowned, her hand tracing a line of text. This is an attempt to carve out a piece of White Harbor that's not under our control. If we allow it, we might let in a Trojan horse. But if we reject it outright, we risk angering a potential ally and losing out on profitable trade. John exhaled slowly. We propose a counteroffer. We allow them to set up a trading house, but under White Harbor's laws. If they accept, perhaps they truly wish commerce. If not, then we know their intentions were ill. Elora nodded. Agreed. We have to tread carefully. The next day, they delivered the counterproposal to Miranai. Her reaction was cordial but guarded. She hinted that her backers in Pentos might not be pleased to forego extraterritorial privileges. John remained firm, reminding her that White Harbor was not King's Landing or Old Town. It was a northern city, and the North's laws were not up for negotiation. Miranai left soon after, promising to relay the response to her superiors. Whether they would return with a compromise or simply vanish remained to be seen. Not long after, a disturbing development arose that overshadowed the pentoshi negotiations. Reports came of caravans heading toward White Harbor being attacked on the road. Not by common bandits, but by men in black leathers armed with quality steel. They ambushed merchants, seized cargo, and left survivors with dire warnings that White Harbor's rise would be short-lived. John and Elora quickly realized that a single coordinated force was behind these attacks, well-equipped and purposeful. No sigil was seen, no standard. They were ghosts on the road. Lord Wyman, alarmed, urged John to send out a sizable armed patrol. But John knew that might leave White Harbor undermanned. Instead, he assembled a smaller, elite company to track down these raiders and put an end to their attacks. He chose veterans who had fought beyond the wall, men and women who understood stealth and survival. Elora insisted on sending one of her trusted captains, Sir Gareth Saltwind, a knight known for his cunning and loyalty. They departed at dusk, traveling light, determined to find the raiders' lair. Days turned into weeks with no word. The caravans continued, albeit with greater caution, and the city watch tried to secure the roads. But winter's bite began to set in, making travel perilous. Snow draped the land, rendering once easily navigable routes slippery and treacherous. Merchants became reluctant to risk the journey unless escorted. The city's coffers, while still flush, needed continued commerce to maintain the momentum of the projects. Tensions in the council rose, with some urging John to mobilize a larger force to scour the countryside. Elora feared that overreaction might lead to other tragedies. At last, Sir Gareth's company returned. Their group had been reduced in number, a few men missing, but they rode into White Harbor with grim determination. Gareth reported that they had discovered the raiders' camp deep in the Wolfswood, hidden by thick pine and the swirl of snow. They had attempted a surprise attack, but the raiders fought fiercely. Gareth's men managed to kill several, capturing 2. To Gareth's shock, the captives were Northmen, perhaps not highborn, but certainly from the region, if their accents and mannerisms were a New York clue. Under interrogation, they revealed that they had been hired by a shadowy patron who paid them in Lannister gold. Their instructions were simple: disrupt trade, sow fear, and undermine White Harbor's leadership. As for the ultimate goal, the captives knew little, other than that their patron had demanded absolute secrecy. They also mentioned that a man with a foreign accent sometimes came to deliver messages and coin. John recognized the pattern: a hidden hand from the south or across the narrow sea, employing local sellswords to sabotage the North's resurgence. Who specifically stood behind it was still a mystery. The captives mentioned a name, Ravellos or Ravellen. It was hard to be certain. None recognized that name among the known lords or merchants. Elora speculated it might be a pseudonym or a lesser-known agent. One thing was sure: these attacks were coordinated. She and John realized that their next move required cunning, not simply brute force. They planned to spread word that their caravans would soon carry a particularly valuable load: gold from White Harbor's coffers, heading to the Dreadfort for paying local laborers. Of course, the Dreadfort was no longer the Bolton stronghold it had been, but still it needed men to repair the damage from the wars. In truth, only a small amount of gold would be in the caravan, but they would ensure rumors multiplied its value. The day of the caravan's departure dawned cold and clear, fresh snow glinting under a pale sun. Hidden among the wagons were John's best fighters, disguised as merchants and laborers. John himself did not ride with them. He needed to remain in White Harbor to maintain the illusion that this was a routine shipment. Instead, Sir Gareth led the escort, accompanied by Ralph Stonebeard and a group of loyal Manderly men. If the raiders attacked, they would find themselves facing the North's well-prepared trap. Back within White Harbor, winter's hush had settled over the streets. The harbor's surface was iced at the edges, though the main channels remained open enough for trade ships to pass, aided by thick-hulled vessels and skillful captains. Steam rose from the watery breath of men unloading cargo. Elora took advantage of the quieter season to introduce new city regulations, standardized measures for fish and grain, to protect against fraud. It was a simple measure but symbolized the city's intent to become the North's most orderly and prosperous port. John often joined Elora during these proceedings, though he preferred not to overshadow her. When disputes arose between merchants, she mediated with admirable calm, displaying a knowledge of local custom and maritime law that left John quietly impressed. At times, she would look to him for input on matters of honor or martial rule, and he would provide it. They formed a complementary pair. She had the city's knowledge and the quiet steel of a Manderly, while he carried the broader perspective of a man who had seen beyond the wall and faced nightmarish foes. They still learned each other's ways, but the friction that accompanied their first few months of marriage had largely dissipated. Their trap was sprung a week later. Word arrived by Raven that the caravan had been attacked on the road, but the raiders walked into a carefully laid ambush. After a skirmish in the swirling snow, Gareth's men emerged victorious, capturing several more conspirators. Among the prisoners was a foreigner who matched the description of the messenger the earlier captives had mentioned. Under questioning, he revealed little but a single statement. "You cannot stop the tide. There are those who would see your city drown." He refused to name names. John ordered him imprisoned, but the next morning, guards found the man hanging from the rafters of his cell, an apparent suicide. On his body, they discovered a small coin minted with a sigil none recognized. A silver hawk perched atop a tower. The design was reminiscent of some free city or lesser-known merchant house, but neither Maester Theomore nor any of the city's experienced traders had an immediate answer. That night, John stood with Elora on the ramparts of Newcastle, gazing out at the moonlit harbor. The water was calm, reflecting a sky littered with stars. His cloak flapped behind him, and Elora stood close, drawing warmth from his presence. The city lay silent, dusted by recent snowfall, lamps twinkling in windows. It should have been a moment of peace, but unease gnawed at them both. "We're being tested," John said quietly, "by someone with deep pockets and a willingness to kill." Elora nodded, her breath frosting in the air. "We can't let fear paralyze us, but we also can't ignore that this is bigger than a few cells' words. If we're to protect White Harbor, the North, we must be prepared for anything," John finished. They stood there, listening to the distant rumble of the sea against the docks. Though the night was cold, a faint spark of warmth passed between them. They had chosen to join their fates for the sake of the North, forging a union that might deliver stability and prosperity. Now they were discovering the price of that ambition. Yet neither backed down. Jon Snow had faced ice demons. Elora Manderly had endured the brutal occupation of the Boltons. Together, they would not yield to nameless threats in the shadows. Time flowed onward. The year crept deeper into winter. Skies turned leaden, and snows came heavy and often. The White Knife froze in places, though White Harbor's warm currents near the sea kept the port navigable. Trade slowed but did not stop entirely. The city's storage of salted fish and grain proved sufficient to ensure no one starved, though in the outlying hamlets, some families struggled. The Manderlys offered aid, sending out wagons with salted cod and turnips, staving off hunger. This generosity earned White Harbor goodwill among the smaller folk, who remembered how the city had stood by them even in harsh times. The intrigues continued, but no new attacks occurred. Some suggested that the decisive defeat of the raiders on the road had put an end to their sabotage, at least for now. Others believed the conspirators had merely retreated to plan anew. The uncertain calm weighed on John and Elora. They pressed on, overseeing the city's developments, forging trade deals, and strengthening ties with other northern houses. A few voices murmured that White Harbor now surpassed Winterfell as the true heart of the North's power, though most recognized that Winterfell was the seat of House Stark and would remain so. Sansa's letters arrived sporadically, praising their efforts and expressing relief that the sabotage had seemingly ceased. As the snows fell outside, Jon and Elora found a measure of closeness in the warmth of their private quarters. On many evenings, after long days of governance, they would share a fire and a cup of mulled wine, speaking of matters both weighty and trivial. The last time Jon had tried to live a quiet life, it had slipped away like smoke in the wind, but now he let himself rest in Elora's presence. She, for her part, saw the softening in his eyes whenever he looked at her, and she felt her own guard lower, revealing the young woman beneath the mantle of duty. It was a gentle, tentative bond, but it was real. One afternoon, after a snowfall had blanketed the city in pristine white, Elora made her way to the old sept within White Harbor's walls. The Manderlys followed the faith of the Seven, as did many of the city's inhabitants, though plenty of northerners still followed the old gods. The sept was large and well-maintained, with stained glass windows that shone like jewels when the sun broke through the clouds. Elora entered quietly, a sense of peace washing over her. She lit a candle for her departed mother and sister, standing in silence before the altar of the mother. Her breath caught when she recalled the tumultuous events that had shaped her path. Her mother taken by illness, Willa lost in the chaos of the war. Now here she was, married to a man once known only as a bastard, forging the North's new destiny. Footsteps behind her broke her reverie. She turned to see John standing in the nave, cloak dusted with snow. He approached quietly, respectful of the sacred space. Elora offered a small, welcoming smile. He did not kneel or pray. He still kept to the old gods, as most stark-blooded northerners did, but he bowed his head respectfully. A hush lingered between them, a private moment shared away from the bustle of city life. "You're well?" he asked softly, searching her eyes for any sign of trouble. She nodded. "I'm just remembering those we lost. I find it helps sometimes to come here. The stillness. It offers me a chance to breathe." John lowered his gaze. "I understand. I do the same in the Gods Wood sometimes, though the Gods Wood here is smaller than Winterfell's. Still, it's a place to reflect." They stood together near the altar, a gentle hush enveloping them. Elora spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever truly be free of these threats against White Harbor? Against us?" John inhaled slowly. "In Westeros, there will always be those who resent power. But I think we can show them that the North stands together, that we protect our own. If we stay vigilant, if we stay united, we'll endure." She looked at him, and there was an intensity in her gaze. "We made this alliance out of duty, but I never want you to doubt my loyalty, John. Not just to the North, but to you." He placed a gentle hand over hers. "I know," he said, voice thick with sincerity. "You've shown me nothing but loyalty, and far more patience and understanding than I deserve." For a moment, they lingered in that silence, the flickering candlelight dancing over their faces. The bond between them, shaped by duty and tempered by trials, now carried a warmth that might blossom into love if they allowed it. They embraced softly, letting the hush of the sept cradle them. Outside, the winter wind howled, but here, in this moment, the promise of a united future glowed with quiet certainty. When they emerged from the sept, they were greeted by a flurry of activity in the courtyard. A raven from the wall had arrived, bearing fresh news that wildlings who had settled south of the wall were struggling with scarce resources in the cold. Some had begun to trickle further into the north, searching for better farmland or simply survival. John took the message to heart, recalling the oath he had once sworn to protect the realms of men. The free folk were part of that realm now, at least as far as he was concerned. Elora raised the question of how White Harbor might help. Food was precious, but they had more surplus than most northern towns, thanks to the robust trade. Together, they decided to send a shipment of salted fish and grain to a point near the last hearth, where many wildlings were rumored to be gathering. It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one. Some in White Harbor questioned why they should feed wildlings, yet most recognized that a new age demanded new alliances. If the free folk could be integrated peacefully, the North would be stronger for it. John insisted that these shipments be accompanied by watchers, not to intimidate but to ensure fair distribution. Memories of Craster's tyranny and the old prejudices between free folk and kneelers still lingered. The generosity did not go unnoticed. Tormund Giantsbane sent his gratitude, along with a blunt observation that the wolf in you has a heart, Jon Snow. The city's small folk, too, saw that House Manderly's wealth was not hoarded but used to help. Gradually, the rumors of sabotage and unrest began to dissipate, replaced by cautious optimism. The new shipping lanes were safer. The City Watch had grown adept at rooting out trouble. Merchants came from as far as Sunspear to test the waters of this new northern power. And with each successful transaction, White Harbor's reputation, and that of John and Elora, rose. For a time, it seemed that they might have achieved what they set out to do: create a northern coastal power that could stand toe-to-toe with any southern house. Yet neither John nor Elora were so naive as to think all threats had vanished. The question was never if new challenges would arise, but when. The memories of sabotage, shadowy raiders, and the foreign coin burned in their minds. Still, every day, the city stood stronger, the ships sailed straighter, and the people slept a little sounder. There was cause for hope, and it was in that fragile moment of newfound peace that a visitor from King's Landing arrived, bearing a royal decree that threatened to unravel everything. The king or queen, depending on who truly ruled the throne at that point, demanded a formal submission from the North, complete with tribute. The letter's tone was haughty, implying that White Harbor's independence was a slight to the Iron Throne. Rumors also suggested that an envoy of Lannister soldiers might be dispatched to ensure compliance. The North had bent the knee once before, but the scars of the recent wars, the betrayal of the Red Wedding, the cruelty of the Boltons installed by the South, all were fresh. For many, the idea of kneeling again was anathema. Jon stood in the audience chamber with the decree in hand, Elora at his side. Lord Wyman, flanked by a small council, listened gravely. A hush fell as they considered the letter's demands. Would White Harbor's rise be tolerated, or would the crown push to break it? It seemed they now stood on the precipice of a new conflict, one that might pit them against Southern might once again. The lords in the chamber stirred, some muttering that they ought to defy the crown outright, others cautioning that open rebellion could bring devastation. Elora's eyes flashed with anger, though she kept her voice composed. They would demand tribute when the North is still rebuilding. They offer no aid, only commands. Jon set his jaw. We'll send a reply measured but firm. The North has paid its share of blood and coin. We owe no more than any other part of the realm. If they push us, we will stand. Lord Wyman rumbled in agreement, though he also knew the danger of making enemies in King's Landing. Let us also remind them of the alliances we hold, the ships we command. White Harbor is no easy prey. So began a new chapter in the realm's endless game. But this time, the North had a formidable piece on the board, White Harbor, fortified and flourishing, guided by a daughter of House Manderly and a man who bore the legacy of Ned Stark. Together, Jon Snow and Elora Manderly had turned a battered port into a northern jewel, forging alliances and building defenses that promised to shape the destiny of the North for years to come. Though winter still gripped the land, the seeds they had planted bore fruit in every warehouse, shipyard, and loyal heart. If war came from the south, White Harbor would not stand alone. If shadows rose from the east, they would find the city guarded by watchers on both land and sea. And if the old evils beyond the wall ever stirred again, perhaps the North, united under the sigils of the wolf and the merman, might weather even that storm. After all, they had done so before. Night fell upon White Harbor, the moon suspended over the placid waters. Torches along the walls cast a gentle glow, flickering in the wind. Jon and Elora stood atop the battlements once more, side by side. In the distance, the silhouettes of ships rocked gently at anchor, and the city below murmured with the soft lull of the tide. Their cloaks rustled in the cold breeze, yet they did not move apart. They had married for duty and for the future of the North, but in the time since, they had become far more than mere partners in governance. Standing there, they felt the push and pull of history and destiny woven through their joined hands. The North looked to them with hope, and though shadows lurked, for this brief moment, hope prevailed. If any pair could carve out a lasting peace and prosperity in a land so often steeped in blood, it would be them, standing united on the cusp of the cold sea, hearts resolute, carrying forward the legacy of the wolves and the mermen into an uncertain dawn.